The morning Wyatt Callahan stopped breathing right, his horses screamed. Not one neighbor came. Not one soul in Silver Creek rode up that frost-covered hill to check on the strongest man in the county. But one woman did. A woman they called too big, too plain. Too much of everything the world had decided didn't deserve a second look. She walked through his door anyway. She knelt on that cold cabin floor, pressed her hand to his burning forehead, and made him a promise he never asked for.
Vantig.
If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, hit that notification bell and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. December had come to Silver Creek, Montana, the way it always did, without mercy and without warning. One morning the valley was amber and gold cattle still grazing along the frozen edges of the creek. And the next morning the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the first hard snow buried the road into town so deep a horse could lose a leg stepping wrong. Most folks battened down. They pulled their families close, stacked their wood high, and thanked God they had somebody to sit beside a fire with. Wyatt Callahan had nobody. He hadn't had nobody for 6 years, and somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that was exactly how he preferred it. At 41 years old, Wyatt stood 6 feet and 2 inches of pure Montana hardness. Dark hair shot through with early silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite the Rockies were made of. Hands so scarred and calloused from rope and fence wire that women in town said shaking his hand was like shaking hands with the land itself. He owned the Callahan spread, 430 acres of the finest grazing land in the county, a barn that could sleep 20 horses in comfort, and a cabin he had built with his own 2 hands the year he married Eleanor. Eleanor had been gone 6 years. Fever took her in the spring. Quick and quiet and final, the way death comes when it has already made up its mind. She left him the land, the cattle, 2 good horses, and a silence inside his chest he had never once talked about to another living person. He didn't talk about much of anything, truth be told. Wyatt Callahan communicated through work. Through the straight line of a fence post, through the clean knot of a rope, through showing up before sunup, and quitting only when the dark made it impossible to do otherwise. His ranch hands respected him. The men at the feed store nodded when he walked in. The women in town watched him from behind their bonnets and said what a shame it was such a fine-looking man with so much land and not a soul to share it with. He didn't want their pity. He didn't want anything from anybody. And then December came. He had been fighting something in his chest for 3 days before he admitted to himself it was serious. It had started as a tickle. The kind a man ignores because men like Wyatt Callahan did not slow down for tickles in their chest. He had a north fence line that needed mending before the hard freeze, 2 sick calves that needed daily checking, and a load of winter feed to bring in from the east pasture. So he worked. He worked the day the tickle turned into a cough that bent him double. He worked the morning his hands shook so bad he dropped his hammer 3 times before he got a single nail through a fence post. He was still trying to work the afternoon, his vision blurred at the edges, and he had to sit down in the snow because his legs simply stopped holding him up. Get up, he told himself. He got up. He made it back to the cabin. He was not entirely sure how. What he remembered clearly was pushing through the cabin door and thinking he just needed to sit down for a moment, just one moment, and then he would get back up and finish what needed finishing. He sat down. He did not get back up. When Wyatt Callahan finally opened his eyes, truly opened them with the world coming back into focus, instead of swimming in and out like a fever dream, the first thing he heard was the sound of his own horses. Not their usual sounds. Not the low, satisfied noise they made when they had been fed and watered and were content in their stalls. These were distress sounds. High anxious whinnying that cut right through the cabin walls. The kind of noise horses made when something was wrong, and they had been trying to tell somebody for a very long time. The second thing he noticed was that he was lying on his own floor. He had no idea how long he'd been there. The third thing he noticed was a smell, something warm. Something that had no business being in his cabin because he hadn't cooked a proper meal in how long? He genuinely could not say. And then he heard her voice. "Don't you try to sit up yet, Mr. Callahan. I mean that." Wyatt turned his head toward the sound. A young woman stood near his fireplace. She had her back partially to him, tending something in a pot he was fairly certain he hadn't used in years. Her hair was dark pinned back, but coming loose in the heat from the fire. She was wearing a heavy wool coat that had seen better days, and her boots were caked with mud and snow up to the ankle. She was not a small woman. Even from where he lay on the floor he could see that clearly. She was full-figured, round-faced, wide-hipped built, substantial in the way some women were, and she moved around his kitchen with a kind of quiet, purposeful efficiency that suggested she was not particularly concerned with whether he approved of her being there. "Who are you?" His voice came out like gravel dragged across dry wood. She turned and looked at him then. Her eyes were dark brown, and they held the particular expression of someone who had already made a decision long before the other person knew there was a decision to be made. "Amelia Harper," she said. "I live about 2 miles south along the creek road. My father runs the Harper supply route." He stared at her. Something moved at the back of his mind, a vague memory. Fog wrapped a general store, a group of men laughing, a young woman with those same dark eyes keeping her chin up while her cheeks went red. He hadn't done anything about it. He had kept walking. The memory sat in his chest now like a stone. "How long have I been on that floor?" he asked. "I found you yesterday morning," Amelia said. She moved toward him with a tin cup and crouched down, not daintily, not awkwardly, just directly the way a practical person gets close to something that needs attending to. "You had a very bad night. You were talking in your sleep. Mostly you were arguing with somebody who wasn't there." "I don't need broth," she said firmly, pressing the cup toward him. "You need broth, and you need water, and you need to stop trying to tell me what you don't need while you're lying on your own floor with a fever that would have taken a lesser man 2 days ago." Wyatt looked at the cup. He looked at her. Something about the absolute calm in her voice, not unkind, not afraid of him, not trying to impress him, made him reach out and take the cup. He drank. "Your horses are all right," she said once she'd helped him into the chair nearest the fire. He was upright, barely, but upright. "I fed and watered them this morning. Your bay mare, the one with the white sock on her left front, she was the most upset. I think she's the one who kept crying." Wyatt looked at the woman sitting across from him. "Della," he said. "I'm sorry. The mare's name is Della." Something shifted in Amelia's expression, softened just slightly at the corners. "Della," she repeated. "That's a good name. She's a good horse. She was frantic when I got here." There was a pause. Outside, wind moved hard against the cabin walls. Snow tapped at the window glass. "You came in," Wyatt said finally. "Into my barn, into my cabin. Nobody—" He stopped. "Most folks around here know I don't take to people showing up uninvited." "I know," Amelia said simply. "Most folks in Silver Creek know exactly what Wyatt Callahan does and doesn't take to. That's how I knew something was wrong. Because Della doesn't cry like that for nothing, and if you were in any condition to stop her from upsetting the whole neighborhood, you would have." He had no argument for that. "Why?" he asked after a moment. She looked at him steadily. "Why what? Why did you stop? Why did you come in?" He wasn't being cruel. He was genuinely asking. He had spent 6 years making himself into the kind of man people left alone, and he wanted to understand what had gone wrong with his system. Amelia was quiet for a moment. She folded her hands in her lap. Outside, the wind gusted again, and the fire jumped. "My mother was sick for a long time before she passed," she said at last. 2 winters ago. And I kept thinking toward the end about all the people who didn't come, who could have come and didn't, because they decided it wasn't their place, or they didn't want to intrude, or they'd heard she wanted to be left alone. She paused. I decided I wasn't going to be one of those people, not if I could help it. The fire crackled between them. Wyatt didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't come out wrong. "Jean," She left before dark. She said she'd be back in the morning to check the horses and bring more supplies. She said it the way she said most things plainly, without asking whether he wanted her to, without making a performance of her own generosity. At the door, she pulled on her coat and her scarf, and then she paused with her hand on the latch. "You're going to be angrier about all this tomorrow," she said without turning around. "When the fevers come down more and you feel closer to yourself, you're going to be embarrassed that someone found you that way, and probably you'll want me to leave you alone." Wyatt sat in his chair near the fire and said nothing. "I'll come anyway," she said, "because the horses need tending and you're not fit to do it yet. You can be angry if you want. That's your right. But I'm going to keep coming until you're on your feet, and after that it's up to you." She opened the door. Cold air came in sharp and clean. "Miss Harper," he said. She paused. "Thank you," Wyatt Callahan said. It came out rusted and unpracticed like a door that hadn't been opened in years. For the horses. She didn't turn around, but he heard something in the sound of her exhale, quiet, private, before she stepped out into the snow. She came back the next morning as she'd said she would, and the morning after that. She arrived before the sun was properly up, moving through his barn with a lantern, and a familiarity that should have irritated him, but somehow didn't. She talked to his horses while she worked. Not nonsense chatter, real talking, the kind that meant something. She told Della she was a good girl and that she'd been very brave to make so much noise when her person needed help. She told the big roan gelding his name was Cutter, that he was getting extra oats because he'd waited patiently, and patience deserved reward. Wyatt watched her from the barn doorway the third morning wrapped in a blanket, because she'd told him he wasn't to be out in the cold yet, and he'd compromised by staying in the doorway, and he tried to remember the last time anyone had talked to Cutter like that. Eleanor had. He pushed the thought away. "You're staring," Amelia said without looking at him. "I'm watching." "What's the difference?" "Staring's rude," he said. "Watching's just paying attention." She glanced over her shoulder at him, then one eyebrow slightly raised. There was the suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Fair enough," she said, and went back to work. He was nearly on his feet by the end of the first week. Not fully himself, he tired too easily, and there were moments when his head swam if he moved too fast, but functional, capable, able to handle the lighter work while she took the heavier. He told her she didn't need to keep coming. She told him she had a supply delivery in the valley every other day anyway, and his ranch wasn't far off her route. He wasn't sure he entirely believed that. He didn't press it. What he did do, that first morning, he was able to stand at the fence line without needing to grip the post for balance, was watch her carry a full water bucket in each hand from the well to the barn, covering the distance without stopping, without complaint, her breath pluming white in the cold air. He had known men twice her size who'd set one of those buckets down halfway. She didn't set either of them down. "You've done ranch work before," he said when she came back out. "My father's place has animals," she said simply, "and I've been doing for them since I was old enough to reach the feed bins." "Your father lets you take on other folks' ranches in addition to his own." Something shifted in her expression. Brief. Gone before he could read it completely. "My father has 3 sons to help him," she said. "He manages fine without me." The way she said it told him clearly that there was more to that story, and that she had no intention of telling him what it was. He recognized the tone because he used it himself on a regular basis. He let it go. On the 8th day, he cooked her breakfast. It wasn't much. Eggs from his 2 remaining hens. Biscuits from a recipe Eleanor had taught him that he'd never stopped using coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Amelia came into the cabin from the barn pulling off her gloves and stomping the snow from her boots, and stopped when she saw the table set. She looked at it for a long moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't," he said. He set the coffee pot on the table and gestured at the chair. "Sit down, Miss Harper." She sat down. They ate in a silence that was for the first time in 6 years, Not the kind of silence that pressed down on a man from all sides. It was just quiet. The comfortable kind. The kind that didn't need filling. Halfway through her second biscuit, Amelia said, "Della's going to need her shoes looked at before New Year's. Left front is wearing uneven." "I noticed," Wyatt said. "I'll get the farrier out this week. She favors that leg slightly when the ground is hard frozen. Have him check the hoof wall, too." "You noticed that in 4 days." 6, she corrected. "And yes." He looked at her across the table. She was looking at her biscuit with complete focus, as if she hadn't just demonstrated a level of observational attention to his horse that most people who'd owned animals their whole lives never developed. "How old are you?" he asked. She looked up. 24. "Why, just wondering how a 24-year-old woman knows more about my horse's hoofwear than I do." "I've been watching horses since I could walk," she said without particular pride in it. Just fact. Animals don't pretend. They tell you everything they're feeling if you know how to look. "Unlike people," he said. "Unlike most people," she agreed, and she met his eyes when she said it and held them for just a beat longer than necessary before going back to her coffee. He heard them on the 10th day. He was coming out of the feed store in town, his first time down the hill since getting sick, and he'd promised himself he'd only be a few minutes just picking up the order. He'd called ahead when he heard his name and then her name in the same sentence spoken by Hattie Dobbins, who had never in her life encountered information she didn't feel compelled to share with the nearest available audience. That Harper girl spending every day out at the Callahan place. Every single day. A woman he didn't recognize. "What's she doing out there?" "What do you think she's doing?" Hattie said, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering a verdict they've already written, chasing after a man who'd never look twice at her if he were in his right mind. Showing up at his door, cooking his meals, making herself useful so he feels obligated. "You don't think—" "Oh, she thinks," Hattie said darkly. "That girl always was too forward, too much, in every possible way if you take my meaning." The women's laughter was quiet and certain and mean. Wyatt stood outside the door of the feed store with his order list in his hand and felt something move through his chest that wasn't the fever. He recognized what it was. It was shame. Not for Amelia Harper, for himself. Because 3 weeks ago he had walked past a general store where women, these women, or women exactly like them, had laughed at a girl with dark eyes and a straight spine and good hands. And he had kept walking. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't said a word. He pushed open the door to the feed store and stepped inside and didn't say anything to Hattie Dobbins. Not yet. But something had shifted in the gravity of the situation. Something had changed its direction the way a river changes direction when it hits a rock it can't go through. He thought about Amelia's face that morning. The way she had told him without a tremor in her voice that she would come back. Even if he was angry. Even if he wanted her to go. The way she had fed his horses in the dark. The way she had pressed a tin cup into his hands without asking for a single thing in return. The way she'd said animals don't pretend they tell you everything they're feeling if you know how to look. And he thought about himself. About the years he had spent making himself into a man no one could reach, because the alternative, letting someone in, needing someone, being the kind of man who couldn't handle his own life alone, had seemed like something he simply could not survive. He had spent 6 years being certain of that. And then a 24-year-old woman with mud on her boots and warmth in her hands had walked into his barn at daybreak and proved him wrong without even trying. He didn't tell her what he'd heard in town. He wasn't sure what he would say. What he did was watch her more carefully. Not with the detached, slightly resentful observation of those first few days when some part of him had still been waiting for her to ask for something for payment, for thanks for a favor to be returned. But with the quiet attention of a man who has realized slowly, and with considerable resistance, that something he thought he understood has turned out to be something else entirely. He watched her talk to Della about the cold, laying her cheek briefly against the mare's warm neck, with an affection so natural it didn't read as performance at all. He watched her stop in the middle of hauling hay to check on the smaller of his two sick calves, the one that hadn't been gaining weight the way it should, crouching down to run her hand along its side, murmuring something too low for him to catch. "What are you telling it?" he asked. She looked up. There was a piece of hay in her hair. She didn't appear to know this, and he didn't tell her. "I'm telling him he's going to be all right," she said. "Is he?" She tilted her head slightly, considering the calf, with an expression of genuine assessment. "I think so," she said. "He's eating more than he was 3 days ago. And he stood up faster this morning." Wyatt crouched down beside her. The calf turned its big brown eyes on him, and Wyatt put his hand where hers had been along the animal's flank. They were close crouching there, close enough that he could smell the cold winter air still in her hair, and something underneath it, something warm and plain and real. "You're good at this," he said quietly. She didn't answer for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the barn wall and found every gap. "I like things that need tending," she said finally, carefully the way someone speaks when they're saying more than they're saying. He looked at her. She was looking at the calf. "Miss Harper," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "Amelia," he said. "If you're willing." Something moved across her face. Something open and quick gone before he could name it properly, but he'd seen it. "Amelia," she agreed, quietly. And neither of them said anything else. But something had shifted in that barn that December morning. Something that had nothing to do with fever, or horses, or the long silver silence of a ranch at the edge of winter. Something irreversible had begun. And Wyatt Callahan, who had built his whole life around the certainty that he needed nobody, was only just beginning to understand how very wrong he had been. The shift happened the way most important things happen in a person's life, not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement, but in pieces. Small, quiet pieces that didn't look like much on their own, until suddenly you turned around, and the whole shape of something had changed while you weren't paying attention. It had been 11 days since Amelia Harper walked into Wyatt Callahan's cabin and found him on the floor. 11 days since she'd pressed a cup of broth into the hands of a man who hadn't let anyone close enough to hand him anything in 6 years. And in those 11 days, something in the Callahan ranch had changed its sound. Not the horses, though Della had stopped her anxious crying and gone back to her low, contented rumble the moment Amelia started arriving each morning. Not the calves, though the smaller one was eating properly now, and had finally started putting on the weight that had been worrying Wyatt for weeks. The change was in the silence. It was softer now. Wyatt didn't know what to do with that. Yeah, she arrived the 11th morning in the dark, the way she always did, and he was already up at the stove, because he had discovered in the past several days that he woke earlier than he used to. Not because anything had disturbed him, but because some part of him had apparently decided it wanted to be awake before she got there, for reasons he was not examining closely. "You're up," she said, stepping in from the cold and pulling off her gloves. "I'm always up." "Not before the sun you weren't," she said. "First 3 days I had to knock twice before you answered. I was sick those first 3 days. You were also asleep the morning after the fever broke." She hung her coat on the hook near the door. She'd started using that hook without asking, and he hadn't said anything and moved toward the stove to warm her hands. "And the morning after that?" "I sleep light now," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder with that particular expression she had, not quite a smile, not quite a challenge that he'd been cataloging without realizing it. "Light," she repeated. "Don't read into it." "I'm not reading into anything, Mr. Callahan," she said serenely and turned back to the stove. "I'm just noting that you're awake." "Wyatt," he said. She paused. "You've been calling me Amelia for 3 days?" he said. "Seems only fair." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Wyatt." The way she said it carefully, like she was deciding whether a thing was worth keeping, landed somewhere in his chest in a way he hadn't been prepared for and chose not to think about at any length. He put 2 cups on the table and poured the coffee. Yeah, the first real trouble came 2 days later. He knew something was wrong the moment he drove the supply wagon into Silver Creek and saw the way the conversation at the front of Patterson's general store went quiet at the corners of his approach. Not the silence that came when a respected man entered a room. A different kind. The kind with shape to it, with history. He tied off the wagon and walked in. Ted Patterson was behind the counter, and Ted had the decency to meet his eyes, which was more than could be said for the two women standing near the dry goods, who suddenly became extremely interested in a bolt of calico. "Morning, Wyatt," Ted said, and his voice had a careful quality to it. "Morning." Wyatt set his list on the counter. "Got an order to pick up and a few things to add." Sure. Ted picked up the list without looking at it. "Listen, Wyatt, I'm going to go ahead and tell you because somebody's going to, and it might as well be somebody who's got no particular interest in the matter either way." Wyatt looked at him. "People are talking," Ted said. "About the Harper girl. About her spending so much time out at your place." The two women near the dry goods were not looking at him. They were listening with their entire bodies. "People talk," Wyatt said, his voice flat. "They do," Ted agreed carefully. "And what they're saying is, well, there's different versions of it. Some folks say she's after the ranch, after your name. Some folks say she's making herself indispensable because she knows she couldn't catch a man any other way given her situation." The words were delivered with the particular discomfort of a man who doesn't personally believe what he's saying, but has been marinating in it long enough that it started to seem reasonable. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "What's her situation?" he asked, his voice very level. "Well, you know, she's a larger girl. Some people feel she's taken advantage of your illness to put herself in a position. She walked into my barn in the dark," Wyatt said quietly, "when my horses were screaming and I was on the floor with a fever that a lesser man wouldn't have walked away from. She fed my animals. She cooked. She came back every day. She didn't ask me for a single thing." He picked up his list from the counter. "Whatever people are saying about why she did that, they're wrong. And I'd be grateful if you made that clear when the subject comes up." The two women near the calico bolt had stopped pretending to look at fabric. Ted nodded slowly. "Understood." "Add a sack of oats to my order," Wyatt said, "and a second sack of flour. Amelia's been using mine faster than I expected." He said her name deliberately. He said it so the whole store could hear it. One of the women near the dry goods made a small sound that was not quite a word. Wyatt didn't look at her. He picked up his order and walked out. He didn't tell Amelia what he'd heard. He told himself it was because it would upset her unnecessarily, and she was already working twice as hard as any person had a right to ask, and she didn't need the extra weight. That was the true reason. That was the only reason. He spent 2 days being certain of that. Then he came in from the east pasture one afternoon. He was doing full days now. Finally his strength back in a way that surprised him, given how badly the fever had taken him, and heard something he hadn't heard in the Callahan cabin since before Eleanor died. Singing. Low and unself-conscious, the way a person sings when they believe they are entirely alone. A hymn he half recognized, something with a slow and deliberate melody, and Amelia's voice carrying it in the kitchen without decoration or performance, just the song itself, in a warm and private sound. He stopped outside the door for a moment before coming in. Something about stopping felt dishonest, so he pushed the door open and the singing stopped the instant she heard his boots on the step. When he came into the kitchen, she was at the stove with her back to him and both shoulders slightly raised. "Don't stop on my account," he said. I didn't know you were back." The back of her neck was faintly pink. I wasn't paying attention." "I know. That's what made it worth hearing." The silence stretched. "Amelia," he said. You know people are talking." He kept his voice even. "About you being here. About what they think your reasons are." She was still for a moment. Then she set down the spoon she'd been holding and turned around. Her chin was level and her eyes were steady, and there was a slight tightness around her mouth that he recognized now as the expression she made when she was holding something still that wanted to move. "I know," she said simply. It doesn't bother you. It bothers me, she said. I'm not made of stone, but it doesn't surprise me. People have been deciding what I am and what I want for as long as I can remember. She met his eyes. They were doing it long before I ever set foot on your ranch, Wyatt. He looked at her. Did anyone... He stopped. Started again. Has anyone said anything to you directly? Something flickered in her expression, brief and honest. Mrs. Dobbins, she said. At the dry goods 2 days ago, she said... She paused, deciding something. She said that a smart woman knows her limitations, and that a woman who doesn't know hers tends to make a fool of herself chasing something she was never meant to have. The words settled in the kitchen between them like something physical. Wyatt said carefully and precisely, She said that to you. She did. And what did you say to her? For the first time in the conversation, something that was almost a smile moved across Amelia's face. I told her I'd keep that in mind, she said. And then I bought my flour and walked out. He stared at her. That's all you said? That's all I needed to say. She picked up the spoon again. Getting angry at Hattie Dobbins would have made her day. I wasn't interested in making her day. Wyatt stood in his kitchen and looked at this woman, this 24-year-old woman with flour on her sleeve and old hurt sitting quiet behind her eyes, and felt something move through his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the particular feeling of being in the presence of someone who had earned something that most people simply claimed. Dignity. The real kind. The kind that didn't need an audience. He cleared his throat. For what it's worth, he said. I told Ted Patterson this morning that you were here because you were a decent person, and anyone saying otherwise was wrong. Amelia turned to look at him. The expression on her face undid him slightly in a way he was unprepared for. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was more like the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone has just quietly taken a piece of the weight. Temporary, maybe, but real. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know I didn't, he said. She turned back to the stove. Thank you, she said low and private, in the same way he had thanked her that first night at the door. The second week bled into the third, and the third became something Wyatt didn't have a name for. She was there every morning. Sometimes she stayed through lunch. Twice she'd stayed late enough that the dark had crept up while they were talking. Not about anything in particular, just trading words the way people do when words have become comfortable between them. And she'd looked up and said she hadn't realized, and she should go. And he'd said the road in the dark was no condition for a woman alone, and they'd talked another hour while her horse rested in his barn. He learned things. Her mother had been the one to teach her to read animals, a skill the woman had developed out of necessity on a farm with too much work and too little help. Her 3 brothers were all married, all established, and had no particular need for an unmarried sister underfoot, which meant Amelia's official position in the household had a way of being useful without ever quite being essential. She had wanted once to apprentice at a veterinary practice in Billings, but the man who ran it had looked her over once and said he didn't think the work would suit her. She said that last part without heat, matter of fact, which made it somehow worse. Why not? Wyatt asked. He didn't say exactly. A pause. He didn't have to. Wyatt looked at the table. He was wrong, he said. I know he was wrong, she said with the quiet certainty of someone who'd made peace with a thing by being right about it, even when the world said otherwise. Animals don't care what size I am. They care if I know what I'm doing. And I know what I'm doing. You do, he said, and meant it without qualification. She looked at him in a way that was slightly different from the ways she'd looked at him before, as if she was checking whether he meant it, as if she'd been disappointed enough by the words of men that she'd learned to verify. Whatever she saw, she seemed to accept. Your smaller calf's going to be fine, she said, moving off the subject with the skill of a woman who'd learned not to hold on to recognition too long in case someone took it back. He gained another 2 pounds this week. I weighed him this morning. You weighed him. I rigged a rough scale in the barn. I hope that's all right. He looked at her. When did you do that? Tuesday. You were mending the north fence. He shook his head slowly. Amelia. What? You rigged a livestock scale in my barn on your own time because you were worried about my calf's weight gain. She looked at him as if this was a perfectly ordinary thing to have done. Yes, she said. He didn't have words for what he felt in that moment, which was unusual because while Wyatt Callahan was not a talkative man, he generally had words available when he needed them. They were just in storage. This was different. This was words failing to arrive at all. It was Tom Briggs who came to the ranch. Tom Briggs owned the second largest spread in the county, a man with soft hands and a wide smile and a habit of looking at other people's things and seeing opportunity. He rode up to the Callahan ranch on a Thursday afternoon when Wyatt was at the north fence and Amelia was in the barn, and it was Amelia who heard the horse first and came out to meet him. Wyatt was coming back across the field when he heard Tom's voice carrying in the clear, cold air. Don't actually know where he'd be, do you? Since you're the one keeping the place running, seems like. Tom's voice had the particular smoothness of a man who considers himself charming. Though I guess that depends on what else you're keeping for him, doesn't it? Wyatt's pace changed. He didn't run. Running would have announced itself too clearly, and he wanted to hear. I'm sorry. Amelia's voice was quiet and careful. Oh, come on now. No offense meant. I'm just saying Callahan's a smart man. If he's got a situation set up out here that keeps his ranch running while he recovers, who's to argue? Tom laughed. Though I'd have thought he could have found a somewhat more conventional arrangement. Wyatt came around the side of the barn. Tom Briggs saw him, and his smile widened, and there was a half-second where the smile recalibrated got bigger. Warmer wiped itself clean of what had just been on his face. Wyatt, good to see you back on your feet. Wyatt looked at Amelia. She was standing very straight. Her hands were still at her sides. Her chin was level, and her eyes told him nothing, which was how he knew she wasn't all right, because when Amelia was all right, she was never that careful with her face. Tom, Wyatt said, just rode out to talk business. Heard you'd been sick, and I wanted to make sure you knew my offer's still open. For the east pasture. I think we could make each other a real good deal now that... He glanced at Amelia. Circumstances might have changed your thinking. Wyatt looked at Tom Briggs. He looked at the east pasture. He looked at Amelia, and he understood in the space of 2 seconds everything Tom Briggs was implying. That illness had weakened him. That a woman on the property meant trouble or desperation, probably both. That a man in Wyatt's situation, diminished, embarrassed, possibly desperate for a fast influx of cash, might be ready to sell off land he'd never have sold otherwise. My circumstances haven't changed, Wyatt said. His voice was very calm. My thinking on the east pasture hasn't changed, and I'd be grateful if you didn't speak about Miss Harper that way again. Tom's smile flickered. I didn't say anything about... Tom. Wyatt stepped up beside Amelia close enough that their arms nearly touched. I heard what you said. She heard what you said. We both know what you meant, and I'm going to give you the courtesy of telling you directly, don't come out here again with that kind of thing in your mouth. A silence. Tom looked between them. Something shifted in his expression, assessment, recalculation, and then the smile came back smaller and sharper. Well, he said. No offense intended. He touched his hat. Wyatt? Miss? A pointed pause. Harper. He turned his horse and rode. Wyatt stood beside Amelia and watched him go. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Amelia let out a long, slow breath through her nose. You didn't have to do that, she said. It was what she always said. I know I didn't, he said. It was what he always said. But this time it came out different. This time it carried something underneath it, something that was trying to become a word and hadn't quite gotten there yet. Amelia didn't look at him. She looked at the road where Tom Briggs had been. He's not the last, she said quietly. There'll be more like him. Probably. And it's going to keep making things harder for you. My being here. Amelia, I'm just saying it plainly, she said. I'm not angling for anything. I want you to know that. Whatever people are saying, I wasn't here because I thought... She stopped, her jaw set. I didn't come here because I thought you'd owe me something. I came because you needed help and I could give it. That's the whole of it. Wyatt was quiet. I know that, he said. Do you... He turned to look at her properly. She was looking at the road still. And there was something in her profile, something in the particular way she was holding her shoulders, like she was braced for a verdict, that told him she wasn't entirely sure he believed her. That some part of her was waiting for him to come around to the town's way of thinking. To look at her and see what Tom Briggs saw, what Hattie Dobbins saw, what he had once, he was ashamed to admit, very nearly seen himself. Amelia, he said. Look at me. She turned. He held her gaze. I know that, he said again, slower. I know exactly why you came, and I know who you are. Not because somebody told me, and not because I made up my mind in advance. He paused. Because I watched you. Every morning for 3 weeks. I watched you. He let the words land before he continued. There's not a person in Silver Creek who's going to tell me something different than what I already know. She was very still. Something moved through her eyes that she didn't manage to stop in time. Raw and quick and honest. Okay, she said, barely above a whisper. Okay, he said. And then she turned back toward the barn, and he turned toward the fence, and neither of them said another word. But the silence between them had changed again. It had become something neither of them had a name for yet. Something they were both in their separate and careful ways beginning to be afraid of. Christmas was 2 weeks away. That was the thing about December. It had a direction, a destination pulling everything toward it. And whether a person wanted to think about the holiday or not, it showed up in everything. In the storefront windows in Silver Creek, draped with pine boughs. In the way his neighbors were stacking extra wood with a particular anticipation. In the smell of something sweet and specific in the air when Amelia arrived one morning with a cloth-covered dish he hadn't asked for. What's that? He asked. Gingerbread, she said, setting it on the table. My mother's recipe. I make it every year. He looked at the dish. He looked at her. You made gingerbread, he said. For Christmas, she said, as if this was not remarkable. As if she made gingerbread for a man who was not her family and brought it 2 miles along a frost-covered road every December, and this was simply what people did. Don't look at it like that. It's just bread. It's gingerbread. It's flavored bread. Try a piece before you decide what expression to make about it. He tried a piece. It was extraordinary. He didn't say that. He said, it's good. She said, I know. And then she went out to see to the horses and left him standing in his kitchen with gingerbread in his hand, and a feeling in his chest like something long frozen was very slowly beginning to thaw. The ranch hand noticed on a Friday. His name was Gus, 40 years old and built like a fence post with a face that had been weathered by 30 years of Montana outdoors into something that made him look like he'd been dug up from the land itself. He'd worked for Wyatt for 4 years. He was not a talkative man. He and Wyatt got along on the basis of shared silence and mutual respect, and never making the other person explain themselves more than once. Gus came into the barn on that Friday morning while Amelia was there, and he watched her for a minute without saying anything, and then he said, You fixed the east stall latch. It was sticking, Amelia said. I found a spare hinge in the supply box. I was going to fix that, Gus said. I know, you had it on your list. I saw the list. A pause. She look at my lists, Gus asked Wyatt. Apparently, Wyatt said. Gus looked at Amelia with an expression of careful evaluation. You find anything else on that list that needed doing? Your water trough's got a slow crack on the west side, she said. It's not bad yet, but it'll be bad by spring if it's left. And your hay baling in the south stall is stacked wrong weight's going to shift and it'll fall toward the horses. I restacked it. Silence. Gus turned to Wyatt. She can stay, he said, and walked out. Wyatt looked at Amelia. Her mouth was doing the thing it did when she was trying not to smile. Gus doesn't warm up to people, Wyatt said. I noticed. That's the most he's said to anyone new in 4 years. I know good work when I see it, she said, and the not smile deepened. Apparently so does he. And that was the moment. Not a dramatic moment, not a moment with anything extraordinary about it except its own quiet weight that Wyatt Callahan understood he was in serious trouble. Not the fever kind, not the Tom Briggs kind, the permanent kind. The kind that walks into your barn in the dark and fixes your latch and knows your horse's name and brings you gingerbread at Christmas and makes your 30-year ranch hand say she can stay after a 5-minute conversation. The kind that doesn't ask for anything while it changes everything. He stood in his barn, in the December cold, and he looked at Amelia Harper, and he knew, with the same certainty, he knew how to read weather, how to read cattle, how to read the land he'd worked for 20 years, that something had already happened. Something he couldn't unfeel his way out of. Something that terrified him in a way the fever never had. Because the fever had only threatened his life. This threatened something considerably more complicated. She was late the next morning, not by much, half an hour maybe, the kind of late that normally wouldn't register. But Wyatt had been up early. He was always up early now, and by the time 30 minutes had passed, his coffee was cold, and Della had started her low questioning sound that she made when someone she expected hadn't appeared, and Wyatt was standing at the barn door in the cold, telling himself he was not concerned. He was not concerned. When her horse finally appeared on the road moving faster than usual, he told himself the relief he felt was simply the reasonable feeling of knowing his ranch help had arrived. She came in quickly, her cheeks windburned and her breath short. "I'm sorry," she said. "There was my father's mare went lame this morning. I had to see to her before I could leave." "Is she all right?" "She'll be fine, probably. She favored her right foreleg and I was worried about the joint, but it's just bruising. I cleaned it and wrapped it and left her in the stall." She was already moving toward the supply area, pulling on her work gloves. "I should have sent word. I'm sorry. Amelia." His voice came out quieter than he intended. She stopped, turned. He looked at her face, the pink in her cheeks from the cold, the slight tension around her eyes that meant she was running 2 problems at once. "Is your father's horse all right? Not mine. His." She blinked. "Yes," she said. "I think so. I'll check her again tonight." "Good." He paused. "Take your time this morning. The horses are fine. I checked them." She looked at him for a moment. "You checked them," she said. "They needed water. It wasn't—" He stopped. "Yes, I checked them." The look on her face was not the quick gratitude she sometimes gave him. It was slower than that. More careful. Like something she was deciding whether to let herself feel. "Thank you," she said. "It's my barn," he said gruffly. "My horses. I know how to— Wyatt!" He stopped. "Thank you," she said again. Steady, direct, refusing to let him shrug it off. The same way she'd refused to let him refuse the broth that first night. He looked at her. "You're welcome," he said. And then they both went to work. But something had shifted again, another degree, another quiet increment of something that had been moving slowly and steadily in a single direction since the morning she found him on the floor. And the direction it was moving wasn't back. It was never moving back. The question, the one neither of them had asked aloud, the one sitting between them every morning over coffee and every evening at the barn door, was how much further forward it was going to go. And who was going to be brave enough to find out? The question of who would be brave enough was answered in the end by someone neither of them expected. Not Wyatt. Not Amelia. It was answered by Robert Harper. He came on a Tuesday 4 days before Christmas, riding up the Callahan Road, with the particular posture of a man who has decided something and does not intend to be talked out of it. Amelia was in the barn when she heard the horse, and she came out drying her hands on a work cloth and stopped dead when she saw who it was. Robert Harper was a tall man, lean in the way that comes from a lifetime of physical work, rather than discipline, with a face that had the same strong bones as his daughter's, but arranged into an expression she had never once in her life seen soften without reason. He was 53 years old, and had the eyes of someone who kept a running count of what the world owed him and had decided the number was very large. "Papa," she said. He looked at her, then passed her at the barn at the ranch at the systematic evidence of a daughter who had been spending her time somewhere other than the place she was supposed to be. 3 weeks, he said without greeting. 3 weeks Amelia and you haven't said a word about how much time you've been spending out here. I told you I was helping a sick neighbor. A sick neighbor, he repeated in a tone that made the words sound absurd. Wyatt Callahan isn't your neighbor. He's 2 miles up the road, and he's a man who lives alone, and you're an unmarried woman, and you didn't see fit to mention that you've been coming out here every single day. He needed help. He has ranch hands. One, and Gus had his own work to do. She kept her voice even, steady, the way she always kept her voice around her father. He was very sick, Papa. He could have died. That is not your concern. It was my concern, she said, because I was the one who found him. Robert looked past her again, and Wyatt was there. He'd come out of the cabin at the sound of horses moving with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had read the situation from 50 feet away and was taking his time deciding what it required. Something complicated happened in Robert Harper's face. The man he was looking at was Wyatt Callahan. There was no other like him in the county. The ranch, the reputation, the name, all of it landed in the space between them before either man said a word. "Mr. Harper," Wyatt said when he was close enough. He touched his hat brim. "I was hoping to meet you." "Mr. Callahan." Robert's voice had recalibrated slightly. Not much, but enough. "I've come for my daughter." "I figured," Wyatt said. "She's not in any trouble. I know what she's been doing," Robert said. "That's why I'm here." A silence. Amelia said, "Papa." Amelia. Her father's voice cut across hers not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who was accustomed to being the last word. "Go get your things." She didn't move. For 3 full seconds, she simply stood in the space between her father and Wyatt Callahan and did not move. Robert looked at her. Wyatt looked at her. She looked at her father. "My things are in the barn," she said quietly. "My work gloves and my kit. I'll get them when I've finished what I came to do this morning." She held his gaze. "I'll be home before supper." Robert Harper stared at his daughter with the expression of a man who has just watched a door he was certain was locked swing open without a key. He looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked back at him without apology. "Mr. Callahan," Robert said very precisely, "I'd like to speak with you." "Of course," Wyatt said, and gestured toward the cabin. Amelia didn't hear what they said. She wasn't meant to. She went back into the barn, and she worked deliberately and methodically, because working was what she did when she needed her hands to be doing something, so her mind would stop running in circles. She freshened Della's water. She checked the smaller calf 12 pounds heavier than when she'd first measured him, and eating well, and the sight of him standing there solid and warm settled something in her chest. She checked the hay in the south stall, which was still stacked the way she'd restacked it 2 weeks ago, weight distributed properly, no danger of shifting. She had done all of this. She looked at this barn that she hadn't built, and these animals that weren't hers, and she was honest with herself in the way she could only be when no one was watching. She didn't want to stop coming. That was the truth she'd been managing carefully for days, keeping it in a room at the back of herself, with the door almost but not quite closed. She didn't want to stop coming. Not because the animals needed her, though they did, or at least Della had made her opinions on that subject very clear, And not because Wyatt needed her, though. She'd thought sometimes in the early mornings when she arrived and found he'd been up before her and the coffee was already on, that maybe he did not need her, which was a very different and considerably more dangerous thing. She didn't want to stop, because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this cold and working and honest-feeling place had started to feel like something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not since her mother's house before the grief took the warmth out of it. She didn't let herself finish that thought. She heard the cabin door open. Her father rode away 20 minutes later. He didn't come back to the barn. She heard his horse on the road without hearing his voice. And then there was just the sound of Wyatt's boots on the frozen ground coming toward the barn, and she kept her hands busy with the last of the morning work, because she needed to be doing something when he got there. He came in. He looked at her for a moment. "He's not going to make you stop coming," Wyatt said. She turned around. "What?" "I told him your work here has been that what you've done for this ranch in the last 3 weeks is worth more than I could pay for. That you've been more useful and more decent than most men I've hired and all the neighbors I've had." He paused. "And I told him I intended to compensate you properly for it if he had concerns about the arrangement." She stared at him. "You told him you'd pay me." "I told him it was legitimate work, that you weren't here out of—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I told him nobody here had any cause for shame, and he accepted that." A pause. "He had some questions," Wyatt said carefully. "About what?" "About my intentions." The barn went very quiet. Amelia looked at Wyatt Callahan, standing in the doorway of his own barn. In December, his hat in his hands, with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was more like a man standing at the edge of something and deciding whether the drop was survivable. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A long pause. "I told him I was still working that out," Wyatt said. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. Outside wind moved. "That's honest," she said finally. "I try to be." She nodded slowly, put her gloves in her kit, snapped the kit closed. Did everything with her hands to avoid doing anything with her face, because her face was currently trying to do something she wasn't prepared to let it do in front of him. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. She walked past him toward where her horse was tied. Her arm passed within 6 inches of his. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither of them moved away. Christmas Eve arrived the way Christmas Eve always did in Silver Creek, all at once, and with a noise the kind of night where every family in the valley was pulled inward by the specific gravity of the holiday fires, banked high. Children wound up past, bearing old people quiet with the weight of all the Christmases they were the only ones left to remember. Amelia came to the Callahan ranch in the afternoon. She came because she had told herself she was only coming to check on the smaller calf who still needed daily monitoring even though the danger was almost certainly past. She brought a basket covered in cloth because she was bringing food to her own family dinner later, and she'd simply made too much and it made no sense to let things go to waste. This was the story she told herself. Wyatt was at the kitchen table when she came in doing something unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway and looked at it twice. He was writing a letter. He had several pages in front of him, a pen, and the particular expression of a man doing something that costs him something. He looked up when she came in and immediately moved to gather the pages in a way that wasn't quite hiding them, but wasn't not hiding them. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "That's a lot of pages for nothing." "A letter." "To who?" A pause. "Eleanor's sister," he said. "In Missoula. She writes every year at Christmas. I haven't answered in 3 years." He set the pen down and looked at the pages. "I figured it was time." She set her basket down slowly. Wyatt Callahan had not answered his dead wife's sister's Christmas letters for 3 years. And now he was. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She could feel the significance of it sitting in the room between them, like a change in weather, the kind you feel in your joints before the sky tells you anything. "That's good," she said carefully. He didn't look at her. "Do you want help with knowing what to say?" "No." A pause. "Yes, maybe." He pushed the pages slightly toward her side of the table, which was as close as Wyatt Callahan got to asking for something. "I don't know how to start." She sat down across from him. She read what he'd written without commenting on the quality of it, because that wasn't the point. She could see what he was trying to do, trying to cross a distance he'd let grow too long, trying to reach back toward a life he'd been keeping his back to for 6 years. "Start with something true," she said. "Not an apology. Something true." "Such as?" She thought about it. "Tell her about the ranch," she said. "Tell her what it looks like right now. What December feels like here." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't usually talk about—" He stopped. "I know," she said. "But she loved Eleanor too. And Eleanor loved this place. Starting with what's real and present it's a way in. For both of you." He looked at her across the table. She held his gaze. Something in his face was open in a way it hadn't been when she first came. Not completely open. Wyatt Callahan would never be a man of completely open face. But a door that had been shut was cracked, just enough. He picked up the pen. She watched him write the opening line and felt something shift in her chest, tender and frightened in equal measure, and told herself firmly that it was just the sentiment of Christmas Eve. The particular way the holiday made ordinary moments feel weighted with meaning they might not actually carry. She told herself that. She almost believed it. They ate supper together. It was not planned. She hadn't intended to stay, but she'd unpacked her basket while he wrote the biscuits. The cold sliced ham, the small apple cake she'd told herself she'd made because she always made one. And by the time he'd finished the letter and sealed it, the food was on the table, and it seemed unreasonable for her to repack it and ride home in the dark. That was the logic she used. They ate without ceremony, and talked the way they'd been talking for weeks about animals, about weather, about small practical things, except that underneath the practical things, both of them were aware of something else. Something that had been building and hadn't broken yet. "Tell me about Eleanor," she said. She didn't know she was going to say it until it was out. Wyatt went still. Not the angry still, not the shut-down still she'd seen in the early days. A different kind. The kind of still that means something important is being handled carefully. "Why?" he asked. "Because you're writing her sister a letter," Amelia said. "And because you've never mentioned her to me not once in 3 weeks. And because she's everywhere in this cabin, and I think pretending that she isn't is making it harder for you, not easier." A long silence. Then slowly. She laughed a lot. That's the first thing I'd say about her. She laughed at things I didn't expect to be funny, and somehow they always were. A pause. "She loved this ranch. More than I did maybe in the beginning. I built it for practical reasons. She fell in love with it." Another pause. "She had a garden. On the south side. I let it go. After. The one with the stone edge?" Amelia said. "I wondered about that. She put those stones in herself." His voice was quiet. Careful. "One spring. I thought it was unnecessary work. She said it would matter in the winter, that you'd be able to see where the garden was even under the snow. She was right." The fire shifted. "She sounds like someone who thought ahead," Amelia said. "She was. She always was." He looked at his hands. "She would have liked you." The words landed gently, and Amelia felt them land. "I think I would have liked her," she said. He looked up. His eyes were dark and steady and full of something she had no right to the full measure of, and she knew it. She knew what she was doing sitting at this table on Christmas Eve, and she knew what it was beginning to mean, and she knew that the smart and safe and sensible thing would be to pack up her basket and ride home while the road was still visible. She did not move. "Amelia," he said. "Wyatt? What are we doing?" She didn't answer, because she didn't trust the answer that was sitting right at the surface, entirely true and entirely terrifying. "I don't know," she said instead. It was only a partial lie. The knock came an hour later. Loud, deliberate. The kind of knock that means business. Wyatt opened the door and found 3 men on his porch. Frank Dobbins, Hattie's husband, a broad man with a grievance permanently installed somewhere behind his eyes, stood in front. Behind him were 2 others Wyatt recognized as the kind of men who do other men's errands because it makes them feel useful. "Callahan," Frank said. "Got a minute?" Wyatt looked at them. "I'm in the middle of supper, Frank. Won't take long." Frank's eyes moved past Wyatt into the cabin, located Amelia at the table, and came back with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he came to find. "Actually, this is kind of the whole point. We want to talk about the situation you've got going here." Wyatt did not step back from the doorway. "What situation is that?" "You know what situation." Frank's voice was flat and certain, with the borrowed certainty of a man repeating conclusions other people have drawn. "It's Christmas Eve, Callahan, and you've got an unmarried girl alone in your house. People have been patient about this for 3 weeks, but there's a point where it becomes a matter of the community's concern." "It really doesn't," Wyatt said. "She's a young woman," Frank pressed. "She's got no business being here alone after dark. That's just plain decency. And if you don't see that—" "Frank." Wyatt's voice dropped a register. Quiet. Not angry. Something more final than angry. "I'm going to ask you something. How many mornings did you ride up here when I was sick to check on me?" A pause. "That's not—" "How many mornings did anyone from Silver Creek ride up here to check on me?" The silence answered. "She came," Wyatt said. "Every morning, for 3 weeks. She fed my horses and tended my animals and kept this ranch running when I couldn't stand upright. And now you're standing on my porch on Christmas Eve telling me she doesn't belong here." He held Frank Dobbins' gaze. "You don't have a concern for Amelia Harper. You have an opinion about what she is, and you've dressed that opinion up as decency because that's what people do." Frank's face had gone dark. "Now you listen to me." "No," Wyatt said simply. Frank blinked. "No," Wyatt said again. "You've had your say. I've had mine. Miss Harper will leave when she's ready to leave, and she'll come back when she's ready to come back, and what you and Hattie and Tom Briggs and every other person in this valley has to say about it." He held the door, and his own voice, completely steady, "is not something I'm going to spend another minute of my life listening to." He closed the door. Not a slam. A closing, deliberate and final. He turned around. Amelia was standing up from the table. Her hands were at her sides, and her face had the look of someone who has been hit by something they've been expecting for a long time. "Wyatt," she said, "you didn't have to—" "I know I didn't," he said. "That's going to make things harder. For you. With the town. If you—" "Amelia." He crossed the room toward her 2 steps close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. "I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it plainly." She went still. "I don't care about Frank Dobbins," he said. "I don't care about Tom Briggs or Hattie or anybody else in Silver Creek who has something to say about who's in my house and why." He held her gaze and let the words come without checking them, the way he always checked everything. "I care about you being here. I care about why you came in the first place and why you kept coming and what that—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "What that means, about who you are, and what I—" Another stop. "What I've been figuring out that I feel." The fire crackled. She was very still. "Wyatt," she said carefully. Her voice was doing something delicate. "Don't say something tonight because Frank Dobbins was just on your porch. Don't say something because it's Christmas Eve, and we were talking about Eleanor, and the whole night has a feeling to it that—" "This isn't the night talking," he said. "You don't know that." "I've spent 6 years being certain I didn't need anybody," he said. "I know the difference between a feeling that belongs to a night and a feeling that belongs to—" He stopped again. The word sat in his mouth, unfamiliar and enormous. "To a person." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved. And then she said quietly and with tremendous precision, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of being wrong about this." Her voice didn't shake, but it was close. "Of thinking something is real when it's just when you're grateful and it's winter and you've been lonely for a long time, and I was the one who happened to be there." "And if it's real," he said, "then I'm afraid of that too." A pause. "I know what people think I am, Wyatt. I know what they see when they look at me. And I can hold my own against their opinions most days. I've been doing it long enough. But if I let myself, if I believe something, and I'm wrong—" Her voice stopped. The thing she wasn't saying sat in the room between them, unmistakably shaped, like every time she'd been dismissed, overlooked, and handed back her own hope with a note saying it wasn't required. He understood that. He understood it with his whole body. "I know what it costs," he said quietly, "to believe something again." She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "you do." They stood in that knowledge together in front of the fire his wife had loved on the night before Christmas, and neither of them moved toward each other. But neither of them moved away. She left an hour later. The road was cold and clear, and he walked her to her horse and held the bridle while she mounted, and then she looked down at him from the saddle with something in her face that was different from every face she'd given him before. Unguarded. Just her. "Merry Christmas, Wyatt," she said. He held her gaze for one long moment. "Come back day after tomorrow," he said. "There's something I want to say to you when it's not Christmas Eve." Her breath plumed white in the cold. "All right," she said. He watched her ride down the road until the dark took her. Then he went back inside, and he looked at the table where they'd eaten together, and the letter to Eleanor's sister sitting sealed on the corner, and the basket with the cloth she'd forgotten to take, and he stood in the middle of his cabin on Christmas Eve and understood with the terrifying clarity of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself that the worst thing that could happen now was not Frank Dobbins, not Tom Briggs, not the whole town of Silver Creek lined up on his porch. The worst thing that could happen was that he had waited too long, that he had spent so much time being certain he didn't need anyone, that he had used up the window in which the right person might have believed him when he finally said he did. He was not going to wait any longer. He picked up his coat. He was going to say what he had to say, and he was not going to wait 2 more days to say it. He rode hard. The road to the Harper place was 2 miles of frozen ground, and no moon to speak of, and Wyatt Callahan rode it like a man who had just figured out he was already late. The cold hit his face, and he didn't feel it. The horse's breath came in hard white plumes, and he barely registered it. He was running through what he was going to say, which was not something he had ever done before in his life, because Wyatt Callahan did not plan speeches. He said what needed saying, and he said it plainly, and he moved on. But this wasn't plain. None of this had been plain from the moment she'd pressed that tin cup into his hands. The Harper property came up faster than he expected, a modest spread, well kept with a light still burning in the front window, because it was Christmas Eve and families stayed up late. He tied his horse at the post, and he was halfway to the door when it opened. Robert Harper stood in the frame looking at him with the expression of a man who has just been handed a situation he has been both expecting and dreading. "Callahan," he said, "it's 10 o'clock. "I know," Wyatt said. "I need to speak to Amelia. She just got home." "I know that too." Robert looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through the older man's face. Calculation, assessment, something that might have been underneath it all. A reluctant respect for a man who rides 2 miles in the dark on Christmas Eve because he has decided he is not going to wait. "Wait there," Robert said. He closed the door. Wyatt stood on the porch and waited, and the cold settled into his coat, and he didn't move. "Side," She came to the door still in her riding clothes, and when she saw him, her face did three things very quickly, in succession. Surprise, worry, something open and undefended that she pulled back before it could fully arrive. "Wyatt." Her voice was careful. "What's wrong? Is it the horses? Is Della?" "Della's fine," he said. "Everything's fine." "Then why?" "I told you I had something to say, and I didn't want to wait 2 days to say it." He held her gaze. The words he'd been organizing on the ride over had rearranged themselves into something simpler and more honest than planned. "You said you were afraid of being wrong, of thinking something was real when it wasn't, of believing something and getting it handed back to you." She was very still in the doorway. "I said that," she confirmed quiet. "I need you to know that I've been wrong about things in my life," he said. "I was wrong about needing people. I was wrong about what strength looked like. I was wrong." He stopped. "I was wrong about you when I didn't say anything in that store when I kept walking and let those women laugh. I was wrong, and I have thought about that more times than you know." Her breath came out slowly. "Wyatt?" "I'm not finished," he said. "Not harsh, just honest. I need to say this right, and I need you to let me." She closed her mouth. "I don't know what this is yet," he said. "I'm not going to stand here on Christmas Eve and say things I can't back up with action because that's not who I am, and you deserve better than words that don't cost anything." He held her eyes. "But I know that when you left tonight I was standing in my cabin and the only thing I could think about was that I had been the kind of man who waits until it's too late. And I am not going to be that man again." The light from inside the house fell across her face. She looked at him. Really looked at him the way she looked at animals when she was deciding what they needed, except this time it was him, under that gaze, being read with the same quiet and honest attention. "You rode 2 miles in the dark," she said. "Yes." "On Christmas Eve?" "Yes." "To tell me you don't know what this is yet?" He almost smiled. "I told you I wasn't finished." She waited. "I know that I want to find out," he said. "I know that whatever it is, it's real. And I know," he paused, "the last thing settled into place. I know that you walking into my barn was the first thing that's happened in 6 years that made me feel like the world had more in it than just getting through each day." The silence was complete. A log shifted somewhere inside the house. The cold pressed around them both. Amelia looked at him for a long moment, and what moved across her face this time, she didn't pull back. She let it arrive, let him see it, the full weight of what it cost her to say what she said next. "You come back day after Christmas," she said quietly. "And you say that again, when it's not dark and it's not Christmas Eve, and you've had time to sleep on it. And if you still mean it, I'll still mean it," he said. "Then we'll talk," she said. "Properly." He held her gaze. "Day after Christmas," he agreed. She nodded once. He touched his hat brim, the old gesture, the Western gesture, the one that meant more than a word in the right moment, and he walked back to his horse. He rode home in the dark, and he was not cold at all. Christmas Day passed. The way Christmas Day passed when a person had something to look forward to on the other side of it slowly, and with a restlessness that had nothing to do with the holiday itself. Wyatt fed his animals, made his own meal, wrote 2 more letters that had been overdue for years, and went to bed before 9. He slept better than he had in a long time. The day after Christmas, he was on the Harper Road before 7. She was waiting, not at the house. He didn't make it to the house because she was at the fence line at the end of the property, her coat on her breath fogging in the cold. And when she saw him, she didn't wave or call out. She just stood there and waited until he pulled up and dismounted. "You came early," she said. "I told you I'd come." "I know what you told me." He looked at her. "You weren't sure I would." She pressed her mouth together briefly. "I thought you might in the daylight with the night over. I thought you might think better of it." "I told you I'd still mean it." "I know what you told me," she said again, quieter. I've been told things before, Wyatt. He understood that. He understood it the way he understood how a fence holds under pressure. You know the theory, and then you learn the real test is always the weight it actually carries. Ask me anything, he said. She looked at him. Ask me anything you want to know, he said. About what I feel, about what I mean about Eleanor, about the ranch, about what I think my life is going to look like. Ask me. I'll answer you honestly, and you can decide what to do with it. A long pause. The question she finally asked was not the one he expected. Do you see me? She said. Not what I did for the ranch. Not what I know about animals. Me. The way I am. The whole of it. Her voice was controlled and direct, and underneath the control was something stripped bare and real. Because I've had people tell me they valued me, and what they meant was they valued what I could do, and I need to know if you understand the difference. He didn't answer immediately. He took his time with it the way the question deserved. The morning after the fever broke, he said. You'd been there all night. I was half out of my head and I didn't know that yet, but you'd been there all night. And in the morning you fell asleep in the chair by the fire. I woke up before you did. He paused. I watched you sleep for about 2 minutes, and what I thought was, this is somebody's whole person. This is a whole person who came here and gave something she had no obligation to give. And she's asleep in my chair, and her boots are caked with mud from my barn, and there's a piece of hay in her hair. And she's... He stopped. She's beautiful. The words sat in the cold air between them, plain and unadorned. Amelia's breath had gone quiet. The kind of beautiful that's got nothing to do with what the women in Silver Creek mean when they use the word, he said. The kind that's inside what a person does, how they move, what they give without counting it. She was very still. That's what I see, he said. You asked me, that's the answer. The silence lasted long enough that he wondered if he'd said too much, if he'd finally gotten ahead of where she was. But then she let out a breath that was long and genuine, and seemed to release something she had been holding for a very long time. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. All right, she said again. And this time there was the beginning of something in her face that was not the careful, controlled thing she usually allowed, but something younger and more fragile and entirely real. I believe you. He looked at her. That's enough, he asked. It's a start, she said. And there it was, the thing she usually held back just past arriving, a smile, real and full and unhidden. It was the first time he had seen that smile without the edges on it, and it undid him quite completely. No, the trouble came back faster than either of them anticipated. It came in the form of a letter 3 days after Christmas, delivered to the Callahan Ranch by the Silver Creek post rider with a particular expression on his face that told Wyatt the contents were known before the envelope was opened. In a town the size of Silver Creek, letters of a certain kind were never truly private. The letter was from the Silver Creek Community Association, which was not an official body of any governmental standing, but carried itself with the gravity of one. It was signed by 7 names. Wyatt recognized Frank Dobbins among them, and it said in the careful, convoluted language of people who want to be cruel, without being on record as being cruel, that the association had concerns about certain arrangements at the Callahan Ranch that were causing distress to the moral fabric of the community, and that they were requesting formally that Wyatt Callahan clarify his intentions with regard to the Harper woman or discontinue the arrangement that was causing concern. They called her the Harper woman, not Miss Harper, not Amelia Harper, the Harper woman. Wyatt read the letter once. Then he folded it with precise and controlled movements, set it on the table, and stood in his kitchen for approximately 45 seconds. Then he put on his coat and rode to town. The association met on the last Friday of each month in the back room of Patterson's General Store. It was not the last Friday of the month. It was a Thursday. Wyatt did not particularly care. He walked into Patterson's past Ted at the counter, who looked at him with an expression that said he knew exactly why Wyatt was there and was very glad the back room had a second door. He pushed through to the back without asking and found 4 of the 7 signatories present. Frank Dobbins, Bill Mercer, old Curtis Hale, who had no business being involved in anyone's personal life at 72, but managed it consistently, and a man named Stu Albright, who had appointed himself the moral authority of the valley sometime around 1878 and had never stepped down from the position. They looked up when he came in. "Callahan," Frank said, rising slightly. "This isn't—" "Sit down, Frank," Wyatt said. Frank sat down. "I got your letter," Wyatt said. He pulled it from his coat and set it on the table flat, without drama. "I wanted to respond in person because I think some things need to be said face to face." He looked at each man in turn. He took his time. "Amelia Harper came to my ranch 3 weeks ago because I was sick and my horses were in distress, and she was decent enough to stop and help," he said. "She did work for that ranch that most men I've hired couldn't manage, and she did it without being asked and without asking for anything back. She is 24 years old, and she is one of the finest people I have encountered in my entire life." He paused. "Not in my entire life on the frontier. Not in my entire life since my wife died. In my entire life." Curtis Hale shifted in his chair. Bill Mercer was looking at the table. "The concerns in your letter," Wyatt continued, "are not concerns for Amelia Harper. They are not concerns for my ranch or my name or the moral fabric of this community." He let each word land cleanly. "They are concerns about a young woman who doesn't fit a particular picture, who had the audacity to be useful and present and good at something, and who has been doing both of those things in a way some people in this town find uncomfortable because it doesn't match what they've decided she's supposed to be." Frank Dobbins had gone red. "Now you listen here. I am done listening," Wyatt said, and his voice went very quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted. "You've had 3 weeks of listening. You've had Hattie Dobbins at the dry goods store telling a 24-year-old woman she doesn't know her limitations. You've had Tom Briggs on my property saying things that a man with any decency would have swallowed before they reached his mouth. You've had an entire town deciding what Amelia Harper is worth based on." He stopped. Let the air in the room go still. "Based on what she looks like." Silence. "Not what she does," he said. "Not what she knows. Not who she is. What she looks like." Old Curtis Hale looked up. "I did that too," Wyatt said, and it cost him something to say it, which was exactly why he said it. "I walked past her in the general store and I kept going because I'd already made up my mind about what I was looking at before I'd paid any real attention. That was wrong. I have to live with that." He looked at Frank Dobbins. "What I'm asking is that you consider whether you'd like to live with it too." The room was entirely still. "My intentions," he said, returning to the letter's language, "are my own business and hers. But if you're asking whether I intend to keep seeing Amelia Harper, yes, I do. If you're asking whether I intend to let this association or this town or anyone in it tell me that's wrong, no, I don't." He picked up the letter from the table. He folded it and put it back in his coat. "I'll see myself out," he said. He walked back through the store. Ted was restocking a shelf near the front with particular focus, and Wyatt noticed that 2 other people who had been browsing when he arrived were still somehow present, and very still and very quiet. He nodded at Ted. He walked out. He told Amelia that evening what he'd done. He told it plainly and without embellishment, the way he'd tell her about a fence that needed mending or a calf that was gaining weight. He sat across from her at his kitchen table and said, "I went to the association today, and I said what needed saying." She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "They're going to be angry," she said. "Yes. Frank Dobbins has a long memory." "I'm sure he does." "And you did this anyway?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Wyatt," she said carefully, "people have been saying things about me my whole life, and I have learned to carry it. You don't have to take that on. You don't have to fight my fights." "I know that," he said. "This wasn't your fight, it was mine." She tilted her head slightly. "They said things about me," he said. "They wrote a letter about you. They've been talking about both of us. And I am a person who says what he means to the face of whoever needs to hear it. That's not fighting your battle." He paused. "That's just being honest." She studied him. "You called me one of the finest people you've encountered in your life," she said. He went still. "The postwriter told half the town what was in your letter," she said gently. "By the time word came back to me, it was already all over Silver Creek what you said to the association." "A beat. I meant it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That's why I'm telling you that I—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. "That I don't know what to do with somebody like you?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent my whole life learning how to be in a world that had mostly decided what I was before I walked in the room." Her voice was steady and honest. "I got very good at not expecting much, at taking care of things and not asking for things back, at being useful so I'd have a reason to be present." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "And you are undoing all of that very systematically, and I am not entirely sure I know how to receive it." He looked at her hands on the table. He reached across and put his hand over hers. She went very still. "You don't have to know how right now," he said. "You can learn it the same way you learned everything else, a little at a time." She looked down at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over slowly and held his. "All right," she said barely above a whisper. The twist came from where twists almost always come from the direction you stopped watching because you thought the problem was somewhere else. It came from her brother. Not all three of them. Just Thomas the eldest, who rode up to the Callahan ranch on a cold morning, 4 days into the new year, with the expression of a man who had just heard something that had rearranged his plan for the future. Wyatt was at the fence, and Amelia was in the barn, and it was Wyatt who saw Thomas Harper first riding in with that expression. Thomas was 30 years old, broad with his father's face, and considerably less of his father's restraint. He pulled up and looked at Wyatt and said, "Is my sister here?" "She's in the barn," Wyatt said. Thomas looked at the barn, looked at Wyatt, looked at the ranch with the sweeping assessment of a man who is calculating the value of things that aren't his. "I'll tell you what I told your father," Wyatt said before Thomas could speak. "Your sister is here doing legitimate work, and she's treated with complete respect, and you're welcome to speak to her directly about anything else." "It's not her treatment I'm concerned about," Thomas said. Wyatt looked at him steadily. "Our father talked to us," Thomas said. About what's happening here, about what you said to Amelia." He paused, and something in his face shifted from the confrontational angle he'd arrived with into something more complicated. "We didn't know. About Mama's garden. About the association letter." He looked at the ground briefly. "About her coming here alone every morning for 3 weeks when he was sick." A pause. "Our family didn't send me to make trouble," Thomas said, and it sounded like it cost him something to say it. "I want to be clear about that. Our father—" He stopped. "Our father has been thinking about things since Christmas. About whether Amelia has been about what she's been carrying that we didn't know she was carrying." Wyatt waited. "She told him she wanted to apprentice in Billings," Thomas said. "Years ago. He didn't know the man turned her down. She didn't tell us." He looked up. "She didn't tell us because she'd gotten used to handling things on her own, and that's—" He stopped again. "That's not something I'm proud of." Wyatt looked at this young man who had come expecting a fight and had arrived at a different destination entirely. "Your sister's in the barn," Wyatt said, his voice quieter now. "She'd probably like to hear that from you." Thomas nodded. He dismounted. He walked to the barn. Wyatt stayed where he was and gave them the privacy of it. He heard voices, not words. Amelia's first with her careful control, and then something that came from Thomas that was lower and less certain, and then a longer silence, and then Amelia's voice again, different. Softer. The way a person sounds when they've been handed back something they didn't know they'd given away. When Thomas came out 20 minutes later, his eyes were red at the rims in a way he was clearly managing to ignore. "Mr. Callahan," he said at the horse. "Wyatt," he said. Thomas looked at him. "Wyatt," he repeated. He put his hand out. "Thank you. For what you said to the association. For what you said to our father." He paused. "For seeing her." Wyatt took his hand. "Wasn't hard to see," he said. "Just had to look." Thomas mounted and rode. Amelia came out of the barn 10 minutes later. She had clearly been crying in the clean and private way she did everything. No mess of it, just the evidence in her eyes and a steadiness in her face that said she had done what she needed to do and filed it correctly. "My brother came," she said. "I saw." "He apologized," she said, like she was still deciding what to do with it. He said some things about not seeing what she'd been carrying." She paused. "He's not a bad person, Thomas. None of them are bad people. They stopped looking. At me." She said it without bitterness. Just truth. When you stop looking at somebody for long enough, they stop expecting to be seen. Wyatt walked toward her. He stopped close. "I'm looking," he said. She raised her eyes to his. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to stop," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then, with the same directness she brought to everything, to feeding horses in the dark, to facing down Hattie Dobbins in the dry goods store, to pressing a tin cup into the hands of a man who hadn't let anyone close in 6 years, she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. He went completely still. Her hand was warm, calloused from work, entirely certain. "Good," she said quietly. He put his hand over hers. They stood there in the January cold on the land he had built, and the land she had kept alive, and the land that was beginning in the slowest and most irrevocable way to belong to something larger than either of them had planned on. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The conversation with her father came the following Sunday. Robert Harper had asked through Thomas whether Wyatt would come for Sunday dinner. The asking of it formal and careful, an invitation in the old tradition, the kind that meant something specific, was not lost on anyone involved. Wyatt went. He sat at Robert Harper's table with all 3 of Amelia's brothers and their wives, and a collection of small children, who assessed him with the unfiltered directness of children everywhere, and decided he was acceptable, largely on the basis of the fact that he was very tall and didn't talk too much. After dinner, Robert Harper took him to the study. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and set one in front of Wyatt, and they sat across from each other in the manner of men who have important things to say and are taking their time arriving at them. "You went to the association," Robert said. "Yes, sir." "You said she was one of the finest people you'd met in your life." "Yes, sir." Robert looked at his glass. "I should have been the one saying that, years before you." Wyatt said nothing. "Her mother knew what she was," Robert said. "Margaret knew. She used to say that Amelia was the one who would carry the most and get the least credit for it, and that it was our job to make sure that didn't swallow her." He paused. "After Margaret died, I stopped paying the right kind of attention." He looked at Wyatt. "I'm not asking you to excuse that." "No, sir," Wyatt said. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand what she comes from," Robert said, "and what she's done with it." He picked up his glass. "She's tougher than most men I know. She's also considerably more tender than she lets on. If you hurt her—" "I won't," Wyatt said, simply. Robert looked at him. "You're sure about that?" "No man can be certain of the future," Wyatt said. "But I am certain about what I mean. And what I mean is that she is the last person on this earth I would knowingly hurt. That I can promise you." Robert studied him for a long, steady moment. Then he raised his glass. Wyatt raised his. They drank. On the other side of the door from the kitchen came the sound of Amelia laughing at something one of her nieces had said, genuine and unguarded, the same laugh he'd heard her hold back every day until she thought he wasn't watching, and Robert Harper smiled small and private at the sound of it. Wyatt felt it settle in his chest, like something coming home. He thought this is what it feels like. Not the absence of everything that hurts. Not the erasure of the years that cost something. Not Eleanor's ghost walking out the door. Just this. a table, a fire, a woman's laugh through a wall, and the knowledge certain and terrifying and real that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she had reason to keep making that sound. January settled over Silver Creek, the way January always did, heavy and permanent feeling. The kind of cold that made a person believe in their bones that spring was a rumor someone had made up to get through February. But something on the Callahan ranch was different in January. It had a sound now, not a loud sound, not anything you could point at directly. But Gus noticed it the first Monday of the new year when he came into the barn and found the morning work already half done, and Amelia at the far end talking to Cutter about the weather, the way she talked to all of them seriously, as if they had opinions worth hearing, and Wyatt at the other end doing the heavier lifting with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant he'd been up before dawn, not because something needed doing urgently, but because he wanted to be there when she arrived. Gus looked at both of them. He looked at the barn clean and ordered and carrying the particular warmth of a place that had been properly tended. He got his tools and went to work on the water trough crack Amelia had identified 3 weeks ago, which he had been meaning to get to and which he noticed already partially braced with a temporary fix that had been holding just fine in the meantime. He didn't say anything about any of it, but that evening when Wyatt was doing the books at the kitchen table, Gus came in, poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, because he never asked, and said, "She fixing to keep coming?" Wyatt looked up. "Yes." Gus nodded. "Good," he said. He took his coffee and went back to the bunkhouse, which was for Gus approximately a declaration. The first real test of what Silver Creek had decided to do with the new state of things came on the second Saturday of January at the monthly supply market in town. Amelia went alone. She went because she had her own errands and her own life, and she had decided quietly, firmly, in the way she decided most things, that she was not going to reorganize her life around the possibility of being looked at. She had been looked at her entire life. She had kept going her entire life. That was not going to change because Wyatt Callahan had ridden 2 miles in the dark on Christmas Eve. She was at the dry goods section working through her list when she heard Hattie Dobbin's voice nearby, not speaking to her, just nearby, the kind of nearby that announces itself. "Well, I heard he went to the association and made quite a speech," Hattie was saying to someone Amelia didn't turn to identify. Whether that's admirable or just a man being foolish over a woman who made herself convenient, I suppose people will decide for themselves. Amelia kept her eyes on her list. "Made herself convenient," Hattie repeated with the satisfied air of someone who has coined a phrase they intend to use repeatedly. Amelia put 3 yards of wool cloth on her pile and moved to the next item. "I'll say this," said the woman with Hattie, whose voice was younger and less certain. "She does know animals. My Benny had that trouble with his horse last spring, and she's the one who sorted it when the veterinarian in Billings said there was nothing to be done." A pause. "That's well that may be," Hattie said, recalibrating. "And she brought meals to the Fosters when Clara Foster had her baby and was bedridden for 6 weeks. Nobody asked her to." "I never said she wasn't useful," Hattie said, and the word landed badly, even as she said it in the way that a mean word sometimes turns on the person using it. Amelia finished her list. She brought her items to the counter. The woman who had spoken, she turned now and saw it was Jenny Mercer. Bill Mercer's daughter-in-law, 26, and practical-eyed, met her gaze with the direct look of someone who had said what they said deliberately and wanted her to know it. Amelia gave her the smallest nod. Jenny gave it back. It was not a revolution. It was one woman acknowledging another in a dry goods store on a Saturday morning in January. But it was something that had not been there before. And Amelia walked out of Patterson's with her supplies and her spine straight, and the knowledge that the ground very slowly was shifting under Silver Creek's feet. She told Wyatt that evening, not the Hattie part, the Jenny part. He listened. Then he said, "Bill Mercer was at the association meeting." "I know. His daughter-in-law said that." "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "Things are moving." "Slowly," she said. "Slowly is still moving." He looked at her. "You all right?" The question, simple and direct, carrying the weight of a man who actually wanted the real answer and not the managed one, still surprised her sometimes. She was working on not being surprised by it. "I'm all right," she said. "Hattie Dobbins is not the hardest thing I've faced this month." His mouth curved. Not quite a smile. He wasn't a man of easy smiles, but it was something real. "No," he said. "I reckon not." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man with the silver at his temples and the scarred hands and 6 years of grief worn into him like weather, and felt something she had been careful with for weeks settle into a place that felt cautiously and tentatively like permanence. She was careful with that feeling. She had been hurt by permanence before. But she was learning day by day that some things deserved more than caution. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like what the novels said it would be. There were no novels Amelia had read where the man proposed, while both of them were covered in mud from a difficult calving. In late January, the temperature below freezing, a lantern hanging crooked in the barn because the hook had been poorly set, and she'd been meaning to fix it for 2 weeks. The calf had been positioned wrong, and they'd worked on it together for 2 hours. Wyatt with his hands and strength and experience. Amelia with her knowledge and her patience, and the particular calm she carried that animals responded to even in distress. When the calf finally came and shook itself and stood, both of them were on their knees in the straw, breathing hard, and the relief was so large and so sudden that for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Wyatt laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. Really laugh, the kind that starts somewhere below the chest and comes up without permission. It was low and genuine, and it transformed his face entirely. She stared at him. "What?" he said, the laugh settling. "Nothing." She was smiling without meaning to. "I've just never heard you do that before." "Do what?" "Laugh like that." "Laugh like." He looked at the calf, now nudging its exhausted mother, and shook his head. 6 years, he said. 6 years, and this damn ranch, and not a single easy calving in the lot. "She'll remember this one," Amelia said. "So will I," he said. He looked at her then, still on their knees in the straw, her hair half out of its pins, mud on her coat, on his coat, on both their hands. The lantern crooked above them. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Marry me." Not a question. Not exactly. It had the shape of a question, but the weight of something he had already decided. Amelia blinked. "Right now," she said. "Not right this minute," he said. "But yes." She looked at him, at his face open in the lantern light in a way she had watched it slowly becoming over weeks, the walls not gone, but the door genuinely unlocked. At his hands covered in mud and still warm from work. At the calf standing in the straw behind him on its own legs, new to the world. "You're proposing to me in the barn," she said. "I'm proposing to you where I figured out I wanted to," he said. "Which is here, where you belong." The words landed somewhere so deep she couldn't entirely feel the floor of it. "Wyatt." "I know it's fast," he said, and his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't something honest and exposed that he was letting her see without managing it. "I know 6 weeks isn't the length of time a sensible man takes to make this kind of decision, but I've spent 6 years being a sensible man, and all it got me was a quiet ranch and no good reason to get up before sunup." He held her gaze. "You're my reason. You have been since the morning I woke up on my own floor and heard you talking to my horse like she mattered." She was crying. She hadn't realized it until she felt the cold of it on her face. She was not a woman who cried easily, had not been since her mother died, and she was crying in the barn in January, covered in mud, and she couldn't make herself stop. "Amelia," he said. "I'm not sad," she said quickly. She pressed the back of her hand to her face. "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to say I belong somewhere." His face did something she had never seen it do. It broke open. Not apart. Open. The way a house opens when someone comes home. He reached across and took her muddy hand in his. "You belong here," he said. "If you want to." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. Simple. True. The whole answer. "Yes," she said again, and it came out steadier this time, certain and decided in the way she was decided when she meant something completely. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed it there briefly, and when he lowered it, he held it, and neither of them moved for a moment, kneeling in the straw, while the calf found its feet, and the lantern swung crooked above them. The news reached Silver Creek before they told anyone. This was not surprising. The news of everything reached Silver Creek before anyone told anyone. By the time Amelia rode into town 2 days later, Jenny Mercer had already heard from the post rider who had heard from Gus, who had said only that there'd been a difficult calving and things had been settled, and Jenny had drawn her own conclusions and shared them with the appropriate people, which in Silver Creek meant everyone. The reactions were what they were. Hattie Dobbins told 3 separate people that she wasn't surprised and didn't think it would last. Tom Briggs told 2 people that Callahan had lost his mind, and they could expect the East pasture to be on the market within the year when the whole arrangement fell apart. Bill Mercer said nothing to anyone, but rode out to the Callahan ranch on his own initiative and spent an hour talking to Wyatt about spring cattle prices, which was his way of saying something he didn't have the vocabulary for directly. Ted Patterson, when Amelia came in for supplies the following week, came out from behind his counter and shook her hand and said, "Congratulations, Miss Harper. He's a lucky man, and I hope he knows it." "He's working on knowing it," she said. Ted smiled. "I reckon he'll get there." The twist came on a Thursday. It came in a way that Wyatt had not anticipated, had not planned for, and that initially felt like the ground shifting in the wrong direction entirely. He received a letter from Eleanor's sister, Martha Aldrich, in Missoula. The woman he had not written to for 3 years, and had finally written to at Christmas the night Amelia sat across from him and told him to start with something true. Martha had written back. He read the letter at the kitchen table in the early morning before Amelia arrived, and he read it twice, and then he sat with it for a while. Martha said she was glad he had written. She said she had been worried and had not wanted to push. She said she was coming to Silver Creek in February to visit her friend Clara Foster, the same Clara Foster whose new baby Amelia had been bringing meals to, and that she hoped she might call on him. That was not the part that shifted the ground. The part that shifted the ground was the last paragraph. Martha wrote, "Eleanor told me in the last months that the thing she feared most for you was not her death, but your response to it. She said you would close yourself in and call it strength, and nobody would be able to reach you. She asked me if I ever had the chance to tell you that she wanted the opposite of that for you. She wanted you to need someone again. She said that loving her had been the best thing that ever happened to you, and she wanted that to happen again, not instead of her, but because of her. Because of what you learned." He sat with that for a very long time. When Amelia arrived and he heard her at the barn first as always, Della's greeting sound, rising to meet her, he was still at the table with the letter. She came in, pulled off her gloves, looked at him, and stopped. "What happened?" she said. He handed her the letter. She read it. He watched her face as she read it, the careful way she moved through it, the slight stillness that came over her at the last paragraph. When she finished, she set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. "Eleanor sounds like someone who loved you very much," she said finally. "She did," he said, "and knew you very well." "Better than I knew myself," he said. Amelia looked at the letter. "Do you want to meet her sister?" she asked, carefully, giving him room. "Yes," he said, "I think I do." A pause. "I'd like you to meet her too, if you're willing." She looked at him. "I'd like that," she said. He reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and they sat for a moment in the particular silence that comes when grief and the future occupy the same space without canceling each other out, the way they don't, as it turns out, if a person lets both of them be real. Martha Aldrich arrived in Silver Creek on the second Thursday of February. She was 50 years old, with Eleanor's coloring, but her own particular sharpness, a woman who had lived her own full life and had opinions about things and expressed them without extensive preamble. She took one look at Wyatt when he came to the foster house to meet her, and she put her hands on both his arms and looked at his face for a long moment and said, "You look better than I was afraid you would." "I'm all right," he said. "Better than all right," she said with the assessing certainty of someone who has been watching from a distance and knows the difference. "Eleanor would be very relieved." He introduced Amelia. Martha turned to her and something moved across her face that was quick and complete, the full assessment of a woman who has been thinking about this moment and made up her mind in advance that she was going to be honest about what she found. She took Amelia's hands in both of hers. "You're the one who found him on the floor," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Amelia said. "And came back every morning after?" "Yes, ma'am." Martha looked at her, really looked the way people almost never did, the way that took in the whole person rather than the first impression, and said, "Good. He needed someone who wasn't afraid of him." "He's not frightening," Amelia said. "Most people find him to be," Martha said. "Most people aren't paying attention," Amelia said. Martha's face broke into a smile so sudden and genuine that Clara Foster laughed from across the room. "Oh," Martha said, squeezing Amelia's hands. "I like her enormously." Wyatt beside her felt something he could not fully name, the particular feeling of two parts of a life that had seemed unmixable, finding against all reasonable expectation that they combined. The wedding was in March, small, because Wyatt had no interest in large, and Amelia had no interest in giving Silver Creek an audience for something this private. Robert Harper, and her brothers and their families. Gus, who stood in the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man doing his utmost not to feel things publicly. Martha Aldrich, who had extended her stay by 6 weeks and had in that time become something that nobody had quite planned on a friend, genuinely to Amelia, who had not had many of those and received this one with the careful gratitude of someone handling something fragile and precious. Ted Patterson came. Jenny Mercer came with her husband and her 2 children. The Reverend from the Silver Creek Church, who had known Wyatt for years and had the wisdom to say what was necessary and nothing extra, performed the ceremony in the front room of the Callahan cabin, which Amelia had put clean curtains in because the old ones were embarrassing, and Wyatt had not noticed them in 6 years because he was not a man who noticed curtains. He noticed them that morning. "You changed the curtains," he said when he came in from the barn. "The old ones were embarrassing," she said. "They were fine." "They were not fine." He looked at them. They were yellow with a small pattern he couldn't quite identify at this distance. They looked like something a person would choose for a cabin that had someone in it. "They're good," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder with the expression she had when she was choosing not to say something. "They're good," he said again. And the way he said it meant something more than curtains, and both of them knew it. The ceremony itself lasted 12 minutes. Wyatt said his vows in the way he said everything plainly, without ornamentation, with the particular weight of a man who means precisely what he says, and no more and no less. He looked at her when he said them. He didn't look away. Amelia said hers quietly and steadily, her voice only doing the one small thing at the end, the slight catch that she controlled immediately. And Wyatt squeezed her hand once, when he heard it brief and certain the way he did everything, and she steadied. When it was done, Gus started clapping from the back. Alone at first. Then everyone. Martha Aldrich, Wyatt noticed, was not crying exactly. She had the expression of a woman who is full of something and managing it with discipline, and she caught his eye across the room and gave him a single nod that carried everything Eleanor had asked her to pass along. He nodded back. The real test, the one that mattered more than Frank Dobbin's letter, more than Tom Briggs on the property, more than Hattie at the dry goods store, came 6 weeks after the wedding. It came in the form of a sick horse, not Della. The animal belonged to Curtis Hale, who was 72 and had no business riding the distances he rode in March, and whose horse had come up lame in the mud 2 miles outside of Silver Creek on a Thursday afternoon, and Curtis was too old and too stiff to walk her in, and too proud to ask for help from the first 3 riders who passed him. The 4th person to pass was Amelia. She was on her way back from the Harper property, where she'd been helping her sister-in-law with a difficult situation of a human variety that she'd been consulted on because it turned out people had started consulting her on things. She stopped. She got down and checked the horse. She walked the animal the 2 miles back into town, leading her own horse and walking beside Curtis, who was too proud to say thank you, and too cold and too tired to maintain his pride completely. He said, "I heard what you said to my wife." She said, "What did I say to your wife?" "About knowing animals. About the ones you'd helped." A pause. "Millie Hale, that's her name. You said she'd be all right after the winter flu, and she was." She said, "She was going to be all right regardless. She just needed to rest and drink more water and stop trying to do everything herself." A silence. Curtis said. They walked. "I signed that letter," he said. "The association letter. To Callahan." She kept walking. "I know," she said. "I shouldn't have," he said. It came out with the effort of a man unaccustomed to this particular direction of speech. "I knew Hattie Dobbins was behind it, and I signed it anyway because it seemed easier." He paused. "I'm 72 years old, and I still take the easy road when it's Hattie's voice in my ear." Amelia didn't say anything. "You've got every right to not accept that," he said. "I'm not asking you to." She considered. "I accept it," she said. He looked at her. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "You said what you meant. I believe you." She paused. "Your horse is going to need a poultice on that leg tonight and 2 days of rest. I'll show you how to do it if you want, or I can send Gus over in the morning." Curtis Hale was quiet for a long moment. "You're a better person than most," he said. "I'm a practical person," she said. "Holding on to things costs energy I'd rather spend on something useful." The moment Silver Creek truly turned came not with a speech or a confrontation, but with something so small that most people didn't register it as a moment at all. It came in April. Bill Mercer's grandson had a horse that was badly spooked, a young animal that had been mishandled early and had developed a fear response that was making it dangerous and unusable. 3 men in the county had tried to work with him and failed, and Bill was considering selling the horse at a loss. His daughter-in-law Jenny came to Amelia. She came to the Callahan ranch to the barn where Amelia was working, and she asked directly whether Amelia would look at the horse. Amelia went. She spent 3 mornings with the horse. She didn't force anything. She worked in the patient and particular way she worked, giving the animal time and consistency and the knowledge that the presence beside him was safe. On the 4th morning, the horse let her put a hand on his neck without flinching. On the 5th morning, Bill Mercer himself was in the barn. He watched her work. He watched the horse who had thrown every man who'd tried to approach him stand quiet under her hand. He said after a while, "My daughter-in-law was right." "About what?" Amelia said. "About you," he said. "About what you know." She kept her hand on the horse's neck. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He just needed someone to take the time." Bill looked at her for a moment. "I want to apologize," he said, "for the letter. I want to do that properly, not through somebody else." She looked at him. "Did you mean it when you signed it?" she asked. "Not unkindly, honestly." He was quiet. "I meant that I didn't know you," he said finally. "I let other people's opinions do my thinking, and that's—" He paused. "That's not something I'm proud of." She held the horse steady. "Then we'll start from here," she said. By summer, things had changed. Not completely. Not in the clean, total way that stories sometimes suggest things change when they change. Hattie Dobbins still had opinions. Tom Briggs still had ambitions about the East pasture. There would always be people who decided what they thought before they looked properly. But other things had changed too. Jenny Mercer's husband came to ask Amelia about their milk cow's production drop. 3 families in the valley had consulted her about animal ailments through the spring. A woman named Dora Prentice, who had been unkind to her in the dry goods store 2 years ago, stopped her on the road in May and said her daughter's mare was having trouble, and could she recommend someone, and Amelia said she would come herself, and she went, and she fixed the problem, and Dora Prentice said thank you and meant it. Curtis Hale. When he saw her in town, touched his hat, every time, without fail. The first time he did it, she almost missed it. She was walking out of Patterson's with her supplies, and Curtis was going in, and he lifted the brim of his hat as she passed the old gesture. The gesture that meant something specific in the Western way of things, and she caught it just as she cleared the door. She turned back. He had already gone inside. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Then she kept walking, and she was smiling, and she didn't try to stop it. It was Wyatt who told her what he saw one evening in June. They were on the porch. She had put 2 chairs out there in the spring because the evenings were too good to waste inside, and he had let her without comment and had proceeded to use those chairs every evening since. They were sitting in them now, the day's work done, the ranch quiet and content around them. He said, "You know what this place felt like when you came. I know what you were like," she said. "I can imagine what it felt like. It was a functioning thing," he said. "It had all its practical parts. The animals were fed, and the fences were sound, and the books were balanced." He paused. "But it wasn't—" He searched for the word. "It wasn't alive." She looked at him. "It's alive now," he said. She was quiet. "That's not the curtains," he said, and his voice had something in it that was as close as Wyatt Callahan got to reverence. "It's not the garden, even though you fixed the garden, and it's—" He stopped. Tried again. "It's you. What you brought in when you came in. You are." Another stop. He looked at her. "The best thing that's ever been on this land. And that includes everything I built and everything I worked for and everything I thought I was proud of." Amelia looked at the man she had married. She thought about the woman she had been the December morning she stopped at a strange ranch because a horse was crying. The woman who had walked in not expecting anything except to do a useful thing. The woman who had spent so long not being seen that she had almost stopped expecting to be. She thought about all of it. "I almost didn't stop," she said. "I know," he said. "I almost rode past. I told myself it wasn't my concern. I told myself you'd probably want to be left alone." She paused. "I almost decided it wasn't my place." He was looking at her with the full attention he gave things he considered important, which was the same attention he gave the land and the animals and the work he believed in. "What made you stop?" he asked. She thought about it. "Della," she said finally. "The way she was crying, I couldn't hear an animal in distress and keep riding. That's not—" She paused. "That's not who I am." He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "It isn't." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and took her hand. She held it. "Thank you," he said, "for stopping." She turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said, "for being worth stopping for." The evening settled around them warm and unhurried, the way summer evenings in Montana settle when there is nowhere else to be. The horses were quiet. The garden she'd rebuilt along the south wall was coming up properly now, the stones Eleanor had placed still holding their line under the June growth. The curtains in the front window were yellow with a small pattern that turned out to be flowers. She had identified them finally, and they caught the last light in the way that makes a window look like something worth coming home to. Della made her low, contented sound from the barn. Wyatt's hand tightened slightly on hers. She leaned back in her chair and let the evening be what it was, full and real and hers, and she did not manage her face at all. She let herself feel it completely. The woman nobody had wanted to see. Seen. The woman everyone had decided would never belong anywhere. Home. Not because a place had been given to her. Because she had chosen it. And it had chosen her back. And that in the end was the only kind of belonging that had ever been worth a damn.